Again, I want to welcome you. This is our second week in our series, What Next? Lessons in Navigating Uncertainty. And I don't know if the word uncertainty only applies to us in a big sense or if you're experiencing it personally, but we're talking about what does Scripture say about living through uncertain times. And we talked last week, which you can catch on YouTube if you missed it, that the Bible is full of stories of people who have to navigate uncertainty in life. The scriptures were not written in some locked away library with people who didn't know what it meant to struggle, but rather, most of the time, through transition and uncertainty and the unknown. And so there are plenty of lessons for us to take. We're looking at four things we can do. So this is our second week. And this week we're going to be talking about the fact is that you and I, we can be a little forgetful. Now listen, don't ever ask my wife, okay, if I'm forgetful or not, okay? Because I am definitely, okay, don't ask her because I'll tell you the truth. I'm super forgetful. I don't know about you if you have maybe just a real trouble to remember the little things. I find that one of the worst times for me too is when we're going to go on a trip, when we're about to go somewhere. As much as I think I have everything packed and loaded and ready to go, stacked and piled of everybody's stuff, I always get an hour or two into the drive, or as soon as I buckle my seatbelt on the plane, it's usually about then that I remembered, oh, I forgot whatever it is. There's something about uncertainty and anxiety that causes us to be forgetful. Now, listen, there's some things in life I'm sure we would love to forget. I bet some of your fashion choices from your teenage years, I'm sure you'd like to forget some of those, right? But there's also things that you and I just can't afford to forget. And uncertainty tends to have us focusing so exclusively on the mystery of what lies before us that we oftentimes forget what's behind us. And if you've been a Christian for any length of time, God's faithfulness to you in the past should cast a shadow on your future. God's faithfulness to us in the past should shape our assurance and our perspective about what's going to happen down the road. So when the fasten seatbelt sign comes on, we have to remember. We're going to look at the story of a man who forgot. His name is Elijah. If you turn to 1 Kings chapter 17, and now listen, this is one of those stories that seems so wild. You're like, is this even real? But in Luke chapter 4, Jesus refers to this instance as history. So I'm just going to go with Jesus here, okay? I'm not even going to enter into debate because the story is miraculous, all right? There's a miracle that happens. So I'll tell you about the kingdom, or the context. The context of this is we're talking about Israel, but the kingdom has been split into Israel and to Judah. And Israel had no godly king. God would anytime that would happen, God would send a prophet to correct that king or to be his mouthpiece. So, in this context, at this time, there was a king named Ahab, and he had turned against God. And so, God had sent Elijah as a prophet. Now, Ahab was the most wicked king Israel had had up until then. He was the eighth king of Israel, which was about 70 years after Solomon had died and the kingdom had been split. And he married a woman named Jezebel. Does that name ring a bell? She was a foreign woman, which was against their law. She established Baal worship or Baal worship as the national religion, and pretty much she ran the country. They rebuilt the city of Jericho, even though God had told them not to. And it says this, he did more to provoke the Lord than all the kings before. So God sends Elijah to warn Ahab, and then he cares for Elijah. So God sends, so Elijah announces this judgment, that there's not going to be any rain in the country for several years, and then he hides. So God sends him to the Cherith ravine, and then feeds him through ravens, which is basically, I guess, like the very early version of Grubhub or something like that. I don't know. Like they didn't have cars, so anyway, it doesn't matter. Anyway, but he was there, and the brook of water ran dry, so he sent him to live with a widow named in Zarephath, which is where Jezebel was actually from. Her dad ruled that area. So meanwhile, unbeknownst to him, Ahab is searching everywhere for him. So 3 years later, God sends Elijah back to Ahab to say that it's going to rain. Now God sends Elijah to Ahab a second time to announce the rain. But by this time, Ahab is so angry and desperate. And so here's the deal. Elijah challenges Ahab and challenges this false religion. So Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal and Asherah to this duel to prove whose God was really Lord, like who really was in charge. So they both built altars, and the idea was that they were going to attempt to call down fire from heaven to start these fires. So they both build the altars. 850 or so prophets of Baal spend all day chanting and dancing and cutting themselves. Elijah, on the other hand, drenches his wood and his altar in water and then prays a simple prayer, and God zaps the altar and it blazes. And everybody who sees this is suddenly like, okay, the Lord, he's God. But that's when the story, and you may have heard that story before, but that's when the story takes an interesting twist. If you turn to Kings chapter 19, Jezebel threatens Elijah and he flees to Beersheba and then to Horeb. Now Beersheba is over 100 miles away. It's about 2 weeks' journey, and it's at the southernmost part of the kingdom. In his distress, the Lord meets with him, though. And then he runs for another month. But then God speaks in verse 9. It says, "At that place he came to a cave and spent the night there. Then the word of the Lord came to him, saying, 'What are you doing here, Elijah?'" What are you doing here? The implication is what? What are you doing here as opposed to somewhere else? He's saying, why are you hiding? Verse 10, he answered, "I've been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." You see, he had some facts, and his interpretations of the ones that he did have were actually kind of wrong, right? Elijah's interpretation of uncertainty around him left him afraid. Here was a man who called down fire from heaven, who stopped the rain for years, and now here he is running away from a politician. And as we look, and as God looked at Elijah's circumstances, we're thinking, what are you talking about? After everything you've been through, you're in control. Like, you've got the upper hand in this. And God implies that, as I see it, you're in control. You have them right where you want them. But as Elijah looked at the very same circumstances that you and I and God saw, he sees it differently. He says, as I see it, I've done all I can do. As I see it, there's no hope. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. As I see it, I'm all alone again. How long this time? As I see it, nothing's going to change. And this is where God begins trying to jog Elijah's memory and his perspective. You see, God gave Elijah a not so gentle reminder of who he was and what he could do, and what he could choose to do, right? So he calls Elijah out of this cave and is like, "Hey, I'm going to come." And so like there's this, there's thunder and lightning and an earthquake and all this stuff, but God comes to him in this whisper. He's trying to remind Elijah who he is and his faithfulness. Then he asks Elijah again, one more time, as if to say, in light of who I am and what I can do, what are you doing here? But Elijah just misses it. He's so caught up in what is going on in front of him. And then God informs Elijah of his plan. You see, all this time, unbeknownst to Elijah, God has been working. He's been working behind the scenes all along. Elijah's not alone. God had chosen the next king and the next prophet. They were in place. And not only that, like Elijah wasn't alone, God had preserved over 7,000 faithful people in Israel. Wow, Lord, you've been busy, right? I imagine Elijah in that months-long journey thinking to himself, thinking, what am I doing here? And the problem Elijah had is the same problem that you and I often have. And that's this. There are some things that he forgot about, and there's some things that he didn't know about. Because he had forgotten about God's faithfulness in the past, he had a difficult time factoring in his future faithfulness. And because he didn't know what was going on, he assumed nothing was going on. When we lose sight of God's past faithfulness, we don't factor him into the future either. And our fear can drive us to places where we have no place going relationally or financially or emotionally. You see, as we remember God in our past, we will see him in our future. And there are some things, guys, we have to recognize that our vision and what we see is only part of what's really going on. We have to trust, right? How many times have you made a decision, made a choice, and then you only realize after the fact that there was a lot of information you did not know about? That's why we get inspections on homes, right? That's why you take a car to an auto shop before you buy it, right? So that you can get the full story, so you can have a better understanding of where it is you are. The problem that you and I have is that at any given time, we only have so much information. And if we don't believe that there is a God in heaven who loves us, we will make decisions out of ignorance and out of fear and anxiety, rather than out of a remembrance that God has been good and faithful to us in the past. And he's working even when we don't understand or see it, and that he's going to be good and faithful into the future. Do you know why circumstances put us under the table so often emotionally and physically? We anticipate the future with no thought of God's faithfulness in the past or his activity behind the scenes. When the future is uncertain, this is the second thing you and I have to do. Remember. First, we have to pray, like last week. The second thing you and I have to do is to remember. When looking ahead makes you fearful, look back. There are things that you have forgotten. There's some things that you don't know about. And when we place the uncertainty of the future in the context of his faithfulness in the past and his promised care for us in the future, that's when you and I can experience some rest. That's kind of what worship is all about, right? When we worship, we're rehearsing God's past faithfulness. We're remembering, we're singing songs that say, remember when. I'm looking back and I'm singing because I know that you have done this in the past. And it's not only a remembrance of the past, but then projecting it onto his future faithfulness. We need to be people who think and remember what God has done in the past that's been so good to us, his care for us over the years. And that will help you and I when uncertainty comes. I'm going to go back into our time of worship and then we'll pray together. Uncertainty has this amazing ability to make you and I forget. To forget that God has been good in the past and has promised to continue and that He is actually working right now, even though we don't have all of the information, we don't see all of the pieces of the puzzle, and that He has promised to continue to be involved and to care and to help for us in our time of need. Uncertainty can rob us of all of that. And our solution is to remember. And so there are a few things that you can do to do that. One is to make maybe worship more a part of your life. Musical worship that reminds us of God's goodness and faithfulness. One of the things maybe you have to do, and I hate to talk about journaling because I'm generally really bad at it, but maybe it's worth taking some time this week to maybe not fill out a whole journal, but to maybe list some, maybe 10 things, maybe 5 things, I don't know. What are some times in your life that you really needed God to show up, and He did? Sometimes that you were at the end of your wits or end of your ability, or time where somebody was sick or something was going on, and you cried out to God, and He was there. And maybe the circumstances didn't work out ideally. Maybe it wasn't a perfect end of the story. But in that moment, you knew God was with you. Write that down. Write down a faithfulness journal or post or something, okay? Do something and keep it somewhere. And when the uncertain days come, if they're not already there for you yet, but if you face personal uncertainty or there's a moment where you're shaking and you're afraid, and you don't know what to do, and you're having doubts about what's going to happen in the future, open that journal up. Open that blog post up. Open that thing up and read. And remember, you can trust in the same way that God was with you in the past. He's also working right now for your benefit, and He will continue to do so. He is already working towards the future that He desires, the will of His kingdom that will come. All right? We need to remember there are things that we have forgotten, and there are things that we do not know about. But we can trust that God is good, even in uncertain times. Let me pray, and then we'll close. God, thank You for Your faithfulness and goodness to us, even when we forget. And we often do. We have such short memories, as Your people kind of always have. We see and we cry out for help, and You help us, and we celebrate, but then quickly we forget. And then in the same way as the Israelites wandered the desert, we often are in this circle of faith and trust, and then troubles bring on our doubts and worst fears and the worst part of us. God, You're so gracious to continue to show Your goodness and faithfulness, even so, even though we are like that. And so, God, we thank You for Your grace and Your mercy. And God, for those who maybe don't have a lot of stories because they've never really walked with You, maybe now is the perfect time for them to put their trust in You, to trust that You came to this earth in the form of a man named Jesus, and that God, You revealed Yourself to us through Him, through His words and actions, and that God, You desire to reconcile the whole world, and that You desire for us to become Your children through Him. And that when we do that, and when we have that faith, that God, You bring healing and wholeness and new life into us, that You make us new, that You wash us clean of all of the guilt and all of the baggage that we have, that God, You make us something new, and You give us an amazing story of Your faithfulness and goodness. Maybe today is that first moment where we recognize You are faithful and You are good, because You want us to be Your children, even though we've spent our whole lives doing things our way for ourselves. God, we thank You for who You are. We thank You that even now in uncertain times You are working, and that, God, we can trust that Your eyes are fixed on the future, and You know how to work this out, even when we don't. God, we thank You. Pray it in Your name. Amen. This week, my friends, I hope that you can use this to navigate these uncertain times. Now, first we'll pray, and then remember. Go in grace and peace, my friends, and I truly hope to see you next week.